ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, dear good friends, Professor Ross, and to Kate, to Anne-Grete, and your wonderful teams who have been able to pull this off once again. And when looking at the audience here, I can see, of course, many familiar faces who do the same as I do this time every year, being here, but also a great interest outside of this room for the conference, because it is exactly as you said, Kate, this is really the longest standing conference of this kind in Norway. So all the credit you deserve, all of you, for doing this. I understand that Julian also fully agrees on this. Good, very good. So for much of its history, China has been a major global power. And after a lapse of around three centuries, it has made a resounding comeback. Over the last 4 decades, China has re-emerged as the world's largest trade and shipping nation, the world's second biggest economy, the world's second biggest military power, and a technological giant. Our security has always been affected by developments in other parts of the world, including in Asia. Not least because the two countries that have the greatest impact on European security, Russia and the US, are Pacific powers. Today, however, China's influence is much more direct. China is no longer only a regional power affecting US military posture in the Pacific, it's a global power. With the means and the capabilities to influence international law and institutions, with the strength and technology to be a key competitor of the US in some areas, and with a value set that differs from our liberal norms. It was in a period of great power rivalry that the international system was established. The current era is different, though. Gone is the Iron Curtain. Our economies are intertwined, markets have become global, and the level of interdependence between countries is higher than we ever imagined it to be. The differences between military and civilian technology have also become more subtle. And the world seems poised for a fourth industrial revolution that could once again transform our societies in profound ways. In other words, not only will a new bipolar order be very different from the past one, our old mental maps, our strategies, and our solutions will probably be highly inadequate as well. Containment, for instance, is not a viable path for the future we want. China is the largest trading partner for more than 100 countries, and it is a major stakeholder in global health efforts. It is both the world's largest coal nation, but also a major innovator in renewable energy. Indeed, when it comes to addressing some of the major challenges of our time, China is an indispensable partner, and we need to develop our cooperation further. If we are to keep the transatlantic bond strong, we must also use other means than we did 30 years ago. The transatlantic community is not only bigger today, it is also much more diverse. So how can we pursue a constructive relationship with China and safeguard the benefits of globalization while enhancing our security and keeping the transatlantic bond strong? Over the past few decades, China's GDP has increased 25 times in real terms. Poverty is down more than 65 percentage points since 1990, while infant mortality has dropped a whopping 91 percentage points since 1970. China has become a massive manufacturing base and a huge market, importing everything from salmon to semiconductors. Norway has benefited from China's growth in cheap imports and high prices on our exports. The financial crisis that began in 2009 would have hurt the global economy far more had it not been for the cushioning effect of China's continued growth. Meanwhile, on the international stage, China is engaging in the current multilateral system. In 1984, China acceded to the Biological and Toxic Weapons Convention, and for years it has abided by the missile technology control regime. Between 2000 and 2018, China supported 182 out of 190 UN Security Council resolutions imposing sanctions on states violating international rules. And with 2,500 deployed personnel, China has more UN peacekeepers than the other permanent UN Security Council members combined. And it is the second largest funder of both the UN and UN peacekeeping missions. Finally, but importantly, China has not been involved in armed conflict or insurgencies since the early 80s. But increasingly, praise for China's achievements is giving way to concerns from many quarters about the aims and ambitions of the emerging superpower. Concerns that China is using various methods, including cyber operations, to influence campaigns across the world. Concerns about the human rights situation in China. Fears that China will dominate technology development in the future, including in the military domain. Concerns about the Chinese model of state capitalism and whether or not it allows for free and fair competition. And worries from countries in the region about China's role in the South China Sea. This widespread unease is not surprising, and to a certain degree it has to do with the sheer size and global reach of the new China. The pace at which it has risen to prominence, as well as the growing awareness of differences in terms of political values, ideas, and worldviews. A more powerful China is seeking to influence and shape multilateral institutions in line with its interests. Militarily speaking, it has also grown much stronger. 30 years ago, it would not have made it onto NATO's top 5 lists in terms of military spending. Today, China's military budget is about as big as all of NATO's European military budgets combined. Chinese capabilities are also developing at a staggering rate. In some areas, missiles, cyberspace, artificial intelligence, China is not only seen as a near-peer competitor, but a real contender and a leading innovator. Most observers tend to agree that we are seeing a more multipolar or even bipolar world order in the making. But we have to remain prudent and balanced in our assessment of the implications of this. The world is changing, but it has not been turned upside down. NATO remains the backbone of Norway's security policy, and the US remains our most important ally. The course of history is not deterministic either. Bipolarity does not inevitably lead to instability, rivalry, or conflict. What matters is how we handle it and the choices we make. As the past 40 years have shown, the emergence of new powers can also contribute greatly to global wealth, stability, and security. Euro-Atlantic security is still primarily evolving in response to events in our own region, such as a more capable and assertive Russia, an unstable North Africa and Middle East, and a bigger and more diverse alliance. This is unlikely to change in the short term. The same holds true for allied cohesion. In the long run, rivalry between great powers might take its toll on its cohesion. But as interesting as such speculations may be, it is still far from being a reality. Allied cohesion is still predominantly challenged by internal factors, such as the issue of burden sharing, pressure against common values emanating from within the alliance, and member states having different threat perceptions. China's rise may amplify these challenges. Burden sharing, for instance, may become an even more pressing issue as US military needs in the Indo-Pacific continue to increase. But again, we're not there yet. In fact, the US presence in Europe today is larger than it has been for years. And while the US expects NATO allies to deliver on the 2% pledge, the US has required far more of some of its allies in Asia. Developments in threat perception across the alliance also lend little credence to the idea that the two continents will drift apart in the near future. Attitudes seem to a certain degree to be converging rather than diverging on China, a trend that is also consistent with Allied history. In contrast to many other organizations, NATO has tended to grow stronger and more united in the face of external challenges. The Suez Crisis, 9/11, the Korean War, they are three very different but compelling examples of this. We should not overestimate China's influence on transatlantic cohesion, but nor should we underestimate its impact on international peace and security. Power shifts bring both opportunities and challenges. First, in terms of technology. Global markets where mature and emerging actors compete are key to developing the technology that we need to address major common challenges. But new technology will also change the face of defense and deterrence in the future. High-end capabilities such as cyber capabilities, advanced missile systems, drones, autonomous platforms, they are becoming far more prevalent and accessible. This is the case for a growing number of countries, not only for China. It is already challenging the West's military power, and it will make it even more expensive for us to maintain our technological edge in the years to come. This is not a China challenge per se, but China is seen as the main competitor to the US in this area, and this triggers public debate on rivalry between the US and China. Second, the distinction between civilian and military innovation is becoming less clear-cut than it was in the past. GPS, the internet, digital cameras, and computers all originated in the military domain and then made the transition to our daily lives. Today, the tide is turning. An increasing number of strategically important areas, the private sector is spearheading innovation, research, and development. The strongest powers of tomorrow will probably be those who are the most successful in quickly identifying and using civilian technology and effectively integrating it into military strategy and doctrine. Indeed, our defense and security will continue to become more reliant on the private sector that is both global and digital. And by extension, our value chains are getting longer, more complex, and potentially more vulnerable. Third, the rivalry between China and the US is not primarily of a military nature. It is also economic, it's cultural, and political. And when it comes to security, Europe is not wedged between two great powers, but a more multipolar or bipolar world order will change us in other areas. We must make sure that the supply chains that are critical to Allied defense and deterrence are reliable and secure. But containment cannot be our answer. Closed economic systems may be very secure, but they will not produce the technology and the trade dividends we need to meet other objectives, like solving the climate crisis, reaching the SDGs, or reform our welfare society so that they can effectively deal with, for instance, an aging population. So where do we draw the line? How do we protect critical infrastructure and intellectual property while maintaining global markets and ensuring fair competition? My fourth point is that more is at stake today than the last time the world faced bipolarity. World markets, free trade, institutions, and agreements are all vital to the way our world works. Ideally, we should now be further developing the international architecture. Instead, we are increasingly caught up in an effort to safeguard the existing system in the face of growing pressure, rather than adapting it to new challenges. In terms of disarmament, we already know, to a large degree, what mechanisms and tools work. They have been tried and tested both during as well as after the Cold War. That is to say, under both a bipolar and a unipolar order. But at present, the political climate does not allow us to move forward as we should have done. Last but not least, China and the West have different value sets. During the Cold War, our different values were to a certain extent confined to a specific country or blocks of countries. Today, our value sets meet, compete, and are played out in the same arenas. China seems increasingly intent on influencing international law and institutions and does not shy away from exerting pressure on countries that make choices that are not to its liking. This is not unique to China. In fact, it's quite common for great powers. But the differences between our value sets make it more challenging than before. So how can we deal with these challenges? Power shifts and multipolarity have traditionally been associated with a number of risks, like shifting and opportunistic alliances, secrecy, and inherent instability. I don't believe that there is a single way to avoid dangers of this kind. We have to pursue multiple tracks at the same time. First, we have to preserve the multilateral system, and we need to do so by being both innovative and pragmatic. China is benefiting hugely from international stability and the current world order. It continues to work within a market-based world economy and within the structures of existing multilateral institutions. As a major stakeholder in the international system, China should be allowed and encouraged to take full part and play a constructive role in the whole range of existing multilateral institutions. The process of admitting China on equal terms into existing institutions has been slow. For instance, the IMF and the World Bank remain Euro-American in important respects, at least in terms of their formal governance structure. It will be just as important to include China fully when new rules have to be made, such as in the areas of trade and intellectual property, cybersecurity, and social media and climate change. The engagement of all great powers in international governance has been one of the strengths of the international system we have built since 1945, in contrast to previous structures. We, for our part, have to be pragmatic. Norway is cooperating more closely with like-minded countries, but in key areas such as climate or trade, we could not be averse to also cooperating with other countries like China when they have similar interests in finding constructive solutions. My second point is that foreign policy can never only be interest-driven. We will always work to protect and promote international law and human rights, which are of fundamental importance to international relations and to our countries and to our populations. This is also why I was very clear in my support for the Foreign Minister of Sweden before Christmas in the face of Chinese criticism. As liberal European countries, we cannot and will not renounce the values that have made our countries free and prosperous. Freedom of expression is fundamental to our societies and must be respected. As partners, Norway and China discuss both areas where we agree and disagree, as we meet regularly to consult. We advance Norwegian interests comprehensively. We discuss how to develop our cooperation. And we voice our concern about the human rights situation in China. The situation in Xinjiang is of special concern and has been addressed repeatedly in bilateral meetings and multiple times in the UN, both in Geneva and New York. The last time we discussed this was during our political consultations on the 9th of January. We addressed Xinjiang during the Universal Periodic Review of China in November 2018. We did it when we adopted the report in March 2019. We did it in a joint letter together with 21 other countries in the UN Human Rights Council in July, in a national statement at the Human Rights Council session in September, and most recently at the UN in New York in October last year. Third, NATO is both a North Atlantic defense alliance and a political alliance. We do not see a big role for the alliance in Asia, but it needs to have situational awareness in regions that may have a bearing on transatlantic security. The Indo-Pacific region is very important to the US. It's a region where the US has key allies. And just like the North Atlantic, it is a region where modern capabilities are being put into operation and where the future of defense and deterrence may be defined. Norway has therefore welcomed the discussion in NATO on developments in China and the Indo-Pacific region. Strengthening the political bonds among allies has always been key to forging a strong alliance that can adapt to new challenges. Norway has for years been a strong advocate for further developing NATO's partnerships with Asian countries, including with China. Dialogue on different levels is the best antidote to suspicion, distrust, and misunderstandings. We also have common interests that could form the basis for a future cooperation. Today, much is being written about China's new facilities in Djibouti. We tend to forget that a decade ago, in the same region, the water outside of the Horn of Africa, was where Chinese and NATO vessels first sailed alongside each other in the fight against piracy, albeit in two separate operations. I am encouraged by China's willingness in recent years to take a strong responsibility for UN peacekeeping. Complex crises across the globe are increasing the requirements of UN peace operations in terms of finances, personnel, and capabilities. Indeed, China's growing capabilities are not only a challenge, they also are an opportunity. They can pave the way for a closer cooperation in areas such as counter-piracy, counter-terrorism, and peacekeeping. Fourth, as NATO allies, we must strengthen efforts to build resilient societies, not to contain China, but to tackle the inherent weaknesses and challenges of global and digital supply chains. Our defense and deterrence not only rely on military capabilities, they also rely on a resilient civilian sector, and resources must be available and reliable in a crisis. However, in striving to achieve that end, we must maintain a principled and transparent approach with regard to how we regulate our markets. We will always do our utmost to maintain competition and allow for companies to bid on public contracts in the civilian sector. Indeed, competition is essential to fostering new technology at affordable prices. But competition is a two-way street. We expect China to make every effort to ensure its markets are open to our capital, products, and services in the same way that European markets are open to Chinese export and investment. And it must refrain from practices that distort competition or infringe on intellectual property rights. Fifth, NATO allies and European partners should strengthen their industrial and technological cooperation. We have to make sure that enough resources are invested in research and development. Moreover, a bipolar or multipolar world order is likely to create further inflationary pressure in the defense sector. Therefore, we should revitalize our efforts to promote smart defense in NATO and make sure that we get as many capabilities out of our resources as possible. That's why Norway is very supportive of initiatives such as the European Defence Fund, the European Intervention Initiative, PESCO, and NATO's Framework Nation concept. Finally, but importantly, for the first time in 400 years, the world's political and economic center of gravity is shifting away from Europe and towards Asia. This is happening as we are on the brink of what some have called the fourth industrial revolution, with breakthroughs expected in areas such as artificial intelligence, biotechnology, genetic engineering, and autonomous systems. However, despite all these changes, our security architecture, the CFE, the now defunct INF, New START, Open Skies, the OSCE, the Council of Europe, etc., remains by and large Euro-Atlantic and adapted to the world as it was in the 40s or the mid-90s. This is by no means an excuse for the attempts we're seeing by some to undermine European security architecture. But in a number of areas, there certainly seems to be a need for agreements, institutions, and practices that also include emerging powers, military powers such as China. Without China's participation, there is a risk that new disarmament agreements, for instance, will be irrelevant. In conclusion, dear friends, the path ahead of us is full of dilemmas and difficult decisions. We have to find the right balance between cooperation and competition, between security and prosperity. In line with its size and power, China will seek to shape international norms and institutions in its image, just as other great powers have done before it. And as a result of its economy, its size, its military power and technology, it will continue to evolve as a serious contender to US and Western power. But provided we manage to safeguard the multilateral system, China's rise will also continue to provide opportunities for the rest of the world, as it has done for the past 40 years in many different areas. If we are lucky enough to succeed in our bid for a seat at the Security Council this June, China will also be an important partner in some of our priority areas. We are already working together in the area of peace and reconciliation, where China is playing an important role in many critical situations. I outlined Norway's main priorities in the area of peace and reconciliation in a keynote speech on a peace conference during my last visit to Beijing. These and a range of other examples show the benefits of coexistence and cooperation with major rising powers. Inevitably, there will be competition, there will be disagreement, and there will also be potential for conflicts. But I firmly believe that vigilance and engagement within the framework of a strong multilateral system is the answer. Containment, confrontation, and decoupling are not. Thank you.